Chapter 3 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by GAUME. Letter 3. Continuation of the third prepossession. The doctors of the East and the West, Constantine, Theodosius, Charlemagne, Saint Louis, Bayard, Don John of Austria, Sobieski. Fourth prepossession. The conduct of the Church. Fifth. Those who do not make the sign of the cross. Summary. November 28th. Now then, my dear friend, all those great geniuses, without exception, made the sign of the cross like little children. They made it frequently, and unceasingly recommended Christians to make use of it on every occasion. To make the sign of the cross, says one of them, over those who place their hope in Jesus Christ, is the first and best known thing amongst us, primum est et notissimum. Another, the cross is found everywhere, with princes and their subjects, with men and women, with slaves and freedmen, and all mark it on the most noble part of the body, the forehead. Never cross the threshold of your houses without saying, I renounce Satan and devote myself to Jesus Christ, accompanying these words with the sign of the cross. Cum hoc verbum et crucem in fronte imprimus. Another says, we should make the sign of the cross at each action of the day. Omne Dei opus in signo facere salvatoris. Others again, let the sign of the cross be continually made on the heart, on the mouth, on the forehead, at table, at the bath, in bed, coming in and going out, in joy and sadness, sitting, standing, speaking, walking, in short, in all our actions, verbum dicam in omni negotio. Let us make it on our breasts and all our members, that we may be entirely covered with this invincible armor of Christians. Armemur haec in superbabili Christianora armatura. Even to their last sigh, confirming their words by their example, we see those great geniuses die, like the illustrious Chrysostom, the king of eloquence, in making the sign of the cross. Formed in their school, the noblest Christians follow their footsteps. Speaking of Saint Paula, the granddaughter of Scipios, Saint Jerome says, when she was at the point of death, and we could with difficulty hear her speak, she placed her thumb on her mouth, and faithful to usage, imprinted the sign of the cross upon her lips. Let us go back some centuries and point out some brilliant links in the traditional chain. Without speaking of those immortal emperors, legislators, and warriors, Constantine, Theodosius, and Charlemagne, so faithful to the use of the sign of the cross, let us come to the greatest of our kings, Saint Louis. His friend and historian, the Sire de Joinville, has left us the following testimony. At table, in the council, in the combat, and in every action, the king always began by the sign of the cross. Bayard the knight, without fear and without reproach, is mortally wounded. Worthy of his life, his last act is the sign of the cross, which he makes with his sword. Represented by two fleets of more than 400 ships, the Catholic and Mussulman powers meet each other in the Gulf of Lepanto. On the combat depends the safety of civilization or the triumph of barbarism. The destinies of Europe are in the hands of Don John of Austria. Before giving the signal for attack, the Christian hero makes the sign of the cross. All the commanders repeat it, and Islamism suffers a defeat from which it never recovers. Nevertheless, a century later, it tries to repair its defeat. Its innumerable hordes advance even to the walls of Vienna. Sobieski is called. Compared with those of the enemy, his forces are nothing. But Sobieski is a Christian. Before descending into the plain, he makes the sign of the cross on his army. He himself forms a living sign, by hearing Mass with his arms extended in the form of the cross. It was there, says a Christian warrior, that the Grand Vizier was overcome. I should never conclude, my dear friend, were I to cite, one after the other, all the facts which prove the perpetuity and frequent use of the sign of the cross among the true Christians of every age and condition, in the world as in the cloister, in the East as in the West. Does not this glorious tradition form a passably respectable proof in favor of our ancestors of the primitive Church? What do your young companions think of it? Fourth prepossession in favor of the primitive Christians: the usage of the Church. Ages roll by, and with the times men change. Laws, customs, fashions, language, manners of seeing and judging, all are modified. The Church alone changes not. Immutable as truth, of which she is the mistress, that which she taught, that which she did yesterday she teaches, she does today. She will teach, she will do tomorrow and always. What are her thoughts? What is her conduct with regard to the sign of the cross? There is no point on which her divine immutability is more clearly manifested. For 18 centuries we may say the Church has lived on the sign of the cross. She has not, for a single instant, ceased to employ it. She commences, continues, finishes everything by this sign. Among all her practices, the sign of the cross is the principal, the most ordinary, the most familiar. It is the soul of her exorcisms, prayers, and benedictions. What we see her do in our sight, in our basilicas, she did in that of our fathers in the catacombs. Without the sign of the cross, say they, nothing is done validly, nothing is perfect, nothing is holy. The power of the Church, like that of her divine founder, is exercised on creatures and on man. It extends to heaven and earth. Data est mihi omnis potestas, in caeli et in terra. How does she exercise it? By the sign of the cross. All that she destines for her use, water, salt, bread, wine, fire, stone, wood, oil, balm, linen, silk, brazen figures, precious metals, all that belongs to her children, their dwellings, fields, flocks, implements of labor, the inventions of their industry, she takes possession of all by the sign of the cross. If she wishes to prepare an earthly dwelling for the God of heaven, first of all, the sign of the cross must consecrate the site of the edifice. Let no one, says the councils, dare to build a church without calling the bishop to the place, that he may make the sign of the cross, there in order to chase away the demons. The sign of the cross is the first thing she employs to bless the materials of the temple. She traces it 20 times upon the pavement, on the pillars, on the altar. To render it permanent, she makes it of iron, and places it on the summit of the edifice. When her children come into the house of God, what do they do before crossing the threshold? They make the sign of the cross. By what do the chiefs of prayer, the bishops and priests, begin to celebrate the praises of the Most High? By the sign of the cross. When at the beginning of the office we make the sign of the cross, saying the words, O God, come to my aid, it is as if we would say, writes an ancient liturgist, Thy cross, O Lord, is our help. The hand makes to thee the sign of it, and the tongue prays to thee in it. The demon is the chief of the enemies of our salvation. He governs the world. He flatters the flesh in order to allure us. If then, O Lord, thou wilt aid us by thy cross, he and all our enemies shall be put to flight. See principally the conduct of the Church towards man, the living temple of the Blessed Trinity. The first thing she makes over him after his birth is the sign of the cross. The last, when he returns to the bosom of the earth, is again the sign of the cross. Behold her first greeting and her last farewell to the child of her tender affection. Within the time that intervenes between the cradle and the grave, how many times is the sign of the cross made on man? At his baptism, in which he is made the child of God, the sign of the cross. At his confirmation, in which he becomes the soldier of virtue, the sign of the cross. In the Holy Eucharist, in which he is fed with the bread of angels, the sign of the cross. In extreme unction, in which he is strengthened for the last combat, the sign of the cross. In holy orders and matrimony, in which he is associated to the paternity of God himself, the sign of the cross. Always and everywhere, now as in former times, in the East as in the West, The sign of the cross is made on man. All this is yet nothing. Behold what the Church does, when, in the person of the priest, she ascends the altar. Armed with the omnipotence which has been given her, she comes to command, no longer a creature, but the Creator, no longer a man, but God. At her voice the heavens are opened, the Word again becomes incarnate, and renews all the mysteries of his life, death, and resurrection. Is there an act which ought to be performed with more solemn gravity? An act from which should be more carefully banished everything that might be foreign or superfluous? Now, in the course of this, the action by excellence, the Church, more than ever, multiplies the sign of the cross. She clothes herself with the sign of the cross. She goes through it with the sign of the cross. She repeats it so frequently that the number of times would seem to be exaggerated were it not so profoundly mysterious. Do you know how many times the priest makes the sign of the cross during Mass? He makes it 48 times. I am wrong. Throughout the whole of the august sacrifice, the priest is himself a living sign of the cross. And the Catholic Church, the grave teacher of nations, the great mistress of truth, does she amuse herself by repeating so frequently in her most solemn act a sign useless, superstitious, or of minor importance? If your companions believe this, they are wrong to call themselves unbelievers. It is not credulity that is wanting to them. The conduct of the Church and of true Christians in every age is, then, a victorious prepossession in favor of our primitive ancestors. Fifth prepossession in favor of the early Christians: those who do not make the sign of the cross. There are on earth 6 classes of beings that do not make the sign of the cross. First, pagans, the Chinese, Hindus, Tibetans, Hottentots, and the savages of Oceanica, adorers of monstrous idols, nations most deeply degraded, yet not the less unhappy. They do not make the sign of the cross. Secondly, Mahometans, swine by sensuality, tigers by cruelty, automata by fatalism. They do not make the sign of the cross. Third, the Jews, deeply encrusted with the thick layer of superstition, the living petrifaction of a fallen race. They do not make the sign of the cross. Fourth, heretics, impertinent sectaries, who have pretended to reform the work of God, who, in punishment of their pride, have lost even the last remnant of truth. I affirm, said one of your Prussian ministers lately, that I could write on my thumbnail all that remains among Protestants of common belief. Protestants do not make the sign of the cross. Fifth, bad Catholics, renegades to their baptism, slaves of human respect, haughty in their ignorance, who speak of everything, yet know nothing, adorers of the god of their belly, of the god of the flesh, of the god of matter, whose private life is like a sullied garment. They do not make the sign of the cross. Sixth, beasts, bipeds and quadrupeds of all kinds, dogs, cats, asses, mules, camels, owls, crocodiles, oysters, hippopotamuses. They do not make the sign of the cross. Such are the 6 classes of beings that do not make the sign of the cross. If, before tribunals, the moral character of the plaintiffs or defendants contributes powerfully to form the opinions of the judges, even before the examination of the cause, I leave you to judge whether the character of the beings who do not make the sign of the cross is a small prepossession in favor of the early Christians. In a word, with regard to the frequent use of the sign of the cross, the world is divided into 2 opposite parties. For it, the admirable Christians of the primitive Church, the holiest and greatest geniuses of the East and the West, the true Christians of every age, the Church herself, the mistress of truth. Against it, pagans, Mahometans, Jews, heretics, bad Catholics, and beasts. It seems to me that you can already decide. Moreover, your conviction shall be more strongly confirmed when you learn the motives which justify the one and condemn the other. I will reveal them in the following letters. End of Letter 3.